Hi, my name is Demi Michelle Schwartz, and I'm so excited to be part of the 2026 Writers Workout Conference. This is my second year presenting, and I'm so excited to do a presentation on retellings, reimaginings, and original lore. Before I get into that, I would love to share a little about myself. I am a young adult thriller author represented by Sierra Smith at Seton Hill Associates. I write across age categories and genres for my short stories published in anthologies. Along with being an author, I'm an editor. I have my own business called Amethyst Ink Editorial. I'm an editor for RevPit, and I also do editorial work for anthologies. On top of that, I'm the host of Literary Blend, a publishing podcast. And when I'm not busy in the publishing industry, I'm chasing my other dream as an award-winning songwriter and recording artist. So you might be wondering why I chose this topic for my presentation, and I decided to present on retellings, reimaginings, and original lore because I absolutely love doing reimaginings in my own work and coming up with my own folklore and mythology. And over the past couple years, I've had several short stories published in anthologies that fall under this umbrella, and I also love to pull on folklore and do reimaginings as well for my books. And so from having a lot of experience and knowledge about this topic, I thought it would be perfect for this presentation. I'm going to start off by answering two common questions when it comes to reimaginings and retellings. Question one is, what genres can you do retellings and reimaginings for? And question two, what are the kinds of works that you can retell or reimagine without getting into copyright issues? So to answer the first question, any genre. And I think sometimes when we think of retellings and reimaginings, you commonly think of fantasy because of the magic and the fairy tales, the folklore, mythology. Fantasy is definitely a very popular genre for retellings and reimaginings, but that's not the only genre. Horror is another really popular one, especially when you get into monsters and urban legends and dark folk tales and things like that can really lend themselves to horror retellings or reimaginings. But if you don't write fantasy or horror, you can definitely do a retelling or a reimagining in your genre. So let's take romance, for example. If you absolutely love Romeo and Juliet and you thought, how cool would it be if I did a contemporary romance retelling of Romeo and Juliet, but instead of them having a tragic end, they get their happily ever after? You can do that in romance. If Hansel and Gretel is your favorite fairy tale and you thought, oh my goodness, like how cool would it be if I did a retelling of Hansel and Gretel, but with a sci-fi twist, you can totally do that. So I think it's really cool because even though there are certain genres that we commonly see retellings and reimaginings in, they can really be done in any genre. So no matter what you write, this is something you can pull into your own publishing journey. So the second question that commonly comes up is, what kinds of work can you retell or reimagine, and how do you do so without violating copyright law? The most basic answer is anything in the public domain can be retold or reimagined, but it's more complicated than that, and I'm going to try to break this down as clearly as possible. So let's start with the obvious kinds of stories you can retell or reimagine without running into any copyright problems. These are ancient folklore stories, mythologies, anything from like urban legends from your own cultures, things like that. These are stories that have been passed down for generations and generations that don't really trace back to a single author because these are rooted in cultural beliefs and different mythologies and things like that. So if you want to retell a myth from Greek mythology or Scottish folklore or something in that area, you can do so without worrying about copyright issues. The next kind of story that we often see retold or reimagined is fairy tales. And this is where things can get a little complicated. So Brothers Grimm fairy tales, Hans Christian Andersen's, all of those in the public domain can be used for inspiration for your stories. However, a lot of these stories have already been adapted for other forms of media like TV and film, stage productions, other books that have become super popular that have reimagined these stories. And because there are certain ones that have been done so much, it's extremely important to make sure that you're not doing a retelling or reimagining of a version of that story that has already been retold, but actually returning to the source material in the original version. The best example I have for this is Disney. Disney has done a ton of reimaginings of the princess stories, specifically like The Little Mermaid, Cinderella. And when you run into those kinds of situations, you want to make sure that you're not doing a retelling of Disney's versions of these fairy tales, because you will get in trouble with Disney and nobody wants that. So let's take The Little Mermaid, for example. All the characters in that movie are Disney's intellectual property. That means if you do a retelling of The Little Mermaid, your mermaid cannot be named Ariel, the prince cannot be named Eric, and Ariel's crab sidekick cannot be Sebastian. Those are Disney's characters and they do not appear in the original. And so if you're doing a retelling or a reimagining of a very popular story like that, I recommend not only reading the original and using that as your base, but also maybe watching the Disney movie just to make complete sure you're not using something that you thought was your own original idea, but it was actually something you subconsciously absorbed from watching the movie that is actually from Disney, and other very popular adaptations of these stories to make complete sure you're not taking something from a version of the story that's not in the original. And finally, I'm going to talk about reimagining or retelling other works of literature. We're going to have to get into some copyright law here, but I'm going to try to explain this as clearly as possible. Just keep 1978 in mind, because this is where things changed. Works published before 1978 go into the public domain 95 years after the date of publication. So let's take 2026 for example. Works published on or before January 1st, 1931 are in the public domain. Now, I would still recommend double checking, because there can always be interesting exceptions, but you can typically go by the rule of 95 years after the date of publication, something goes into public domain if it was published before 1978. In 1978, there was a new law that went into effect stating any work published on or after January 1st, 1978 will go into the public domain 70 years after the death of the author. If you have a co-author situation, it will go into the public domain 70 years after the death of the last surviving author. So this raises some questions for the stories in between. Well, what about the stories from, say, 1931 to 1977? This is interesting because it really depends on the individual copyright for those works, their notices, and whether the copyright was renewed. And so if there's a work that you want to use for inspiration for years that was published between 1931 and 1977, you have to do some research on your own to find out if it is still under copyright, or if it's copyright expired. If it's copyright expired, then it is in a public domain. So that's just something you need to check on your own. But typically, work published before January 1st, 1931 is in a public domain now. And anything published on or after January 1st, 1978 will not be in the public domain until 70 years after the death of the author. Now that we got all the copyright law stuff out of the way, let's talk about the spectrum from retellings to original lore. I have several short stories published and anthologies that fall under this umbrella, like I said at the beginning, and I'm going to use a few of them as examples as I move through this section of the presentation. So let's start with retellings. Retellings stay pretty true to the original story. And if a reader is reading a retelling, there are certain elements, themes, settings, character tropes, things like that from the original story that they would expect to see in a retelling. So let's take Hansel and Gretel, for example. If you're doing a retelling of Hansel and Gretel, you will likely have two characters, probably siblings, who are running away from their house or some other place where they were experiencing a toxic situation and they wanted to escape from. And they ran into the woods and they were leaving some kind of trail that they could follow so they knew how to get out. But something happens and that trail gets destroyed and they essentially get lost in the woods. And they eventually find themselves at a cottage or some kind of dwelling in the woods that could be made of candy, might not be, but it just feels very sketchy, and it's a very odd situation that this house or dwelling just happens to be here in the woods. Inside, they would likely find a wicked witch who wants to eat them or kill them or something like that, torture them. And one of the siblings would likely get captured, the other one would have to save them, and the wicked witch will probably get pushed into the oven or burned in another way or killed in some other manner, and then the siblings escape and they're free from their horror. So that is kind of a glimpse into what someone might expect from a Hansel and Gretel retelling. Do you need to hit all those points? Absolutely not. But you should see the majority of those in the retelling, because readers would expect to see similar characters, settings, plot points of Hansel and Gretel in a retelling. The thing with retellings is that they can be more restricting than reimaginings, because you're kind of sticking to the original the closest that you can. But of course, your voice will bring an original flair, and this is a very fun space to explore, especially if you're doing different genres than the original stories. So let's take Hansel and Gretel again, for example. If you write science fiction, it might be super cool to do a Hansel and Gretel retelling that is set in space or on another planet, and you're staying true to the story and its plot and its characters, but we have this whole new setting in space. So that would be super cool for Hansel and Gretel retelling. So that's just one example, but the big takeaway from this is that retellings stay pretty true to the original story. Now we're going to talk about reimaginings, and this is the space where I like to write the most. I think reimaginings are super fun. You can take a lot of creative freedoms with it, and you can be super imaginative. But for me, I think there is a spectrum within reimagining. Some land more on the side of being close to a retelling, but a little too original to be considered a retelling. And others are super loose reimaginings where we see as an anchor point for the original story, but other than that, it's pretty original. And so I'm going to share some of my stories published in anthologies to give you a glimpse into the kinds of ways you can approach doing a reimagining. This first one I'm going to talk about is an anthology called Shadows in the Raven's Eye, a reimagining of Poe's Tales by Zombie Works Publications. As the title suggests, this is a book of Poe reimaginings, and my story is a reimagining of his fable Silence, called Silence is Madness. For me, this is a reimagining that falls more on the end of a retelling, because I stayed pretty true to Poe's story when it comes to certain elements, but I also wrote a complete original character who had her own tragic experience. The story has a different opening, different ending, but there is a section in the middle that pretty much parallels Poe's very closely. And so for that reason, and because I drew on the very core elements and symbolism of his story and put it in mine, it feels more like a retelling, but there's enough originality in it to where I personally wouldn't consider it to be a retelling. This next one is an anthology called Horrific Tales Volume 2 Cryptids by Horrific Publishing. I have a young adult folk horror in here called Where Lava Flows, and it's a reimagining of the Cherufe legend from Chilean folklore. What I love so much about reimagining that legend is because there isn't a whole lot on the legend. Pretty much all I was able to gather from multiple sources when I was doing research was that there's a reptilian monster that lives in Chilean volcanoes, and people believe that in order to avoid the land being hit with volcanic eruptions and earthquakes, they have to satisfy the monster by giving it a maiden sacrifice. And so, because that's the core of the legend, I used that as the basis for my story. It's completely original. It follows two sisters as they are in the circle of girls who are potentially going to be chosen as the sacrifice that year for Cherufe. And it's very tragic. I like to pitch it as the lottery meets the Hunger Games. It definitely has those vibes. And it's pretty original aside from the elements that I drew from the legend. So for me, this story falls more in the middle. I wouldn't call it a retelling because I don't think there's enough on the legend to do a true retelling, because we don't really have characters or solid plot. It's more of a concept and a premise. And it's definitely not a loose reimagining because there's enough from the legend that I was able to stay true to in this reimagining. So for me, it kind of falls in the middle of the reimagining spectrum. Next, I'm going to talk about Enchanted Tales and Twisted Lore, Fairy Tales, Folklore, and Fables reimagined by Cabot Crossing Publishing. My story in here is called Davria's Shadows. It is a new adult dark romantasy reimagining of Death's Messengers, which is a lesser-known Brothers Grimm fairy tale. To me, this is a very loose reimagining, and it's still my favorite short story I've ever written. If you've ever read the original Death's Messengers, it's super short, and I love that because it gave me a lot of room to create my own story. Still, even though Davria's Shadows is pretty original in terms of the character, the folklore, the mythology, and the other elements in the story, there is one specific scene that pretty much parallels the original, and I paraphrase the conversation between the death character in the original and a young man, and Davria and a young man that she meets after he saves her from snow after she falls off a cliff. Basically, because this man saved Davria, she tells him, I will send my messengers to warn you before I come for you myself. In my story, Davria isn't death, but she's a reaper, which is pretty close. And in my story, the messengers are shadows, and they're personified causes of death. And I love writing Davria's Shadows of Death. They were very, very fun. And so even though this story has a direct parallel to the original and it pulls from the messengers idea, like Death's Messengers, it's a complete original story from that. And so for me, this is a very loose reimagining. And I love doing loose reimaginings because you're not really tied down by following anything in the original directly. You can use it more as inspiration and have anchor points in your story that's solidified as a reimagining while creating a very original story. Other ways you can go about doing reimaginings is by taking a different perspective, whether that's writing it from a different character point of view, doing a villain origin story, writing a prequel to a fairy tale, a sequel to a fairy tale. There's a lot of different creative paths you can take in this area, and I have a couple examples from my own published stories to share for this as well. This is an anthology called Cleo's Curious Dash Through Time. This is actually my very first anthology that I got a story published in. My story is called The Scribe from the Lost City, and it is a middle grade historical fantasy origin story for the Atlantis legend. I love the story of Atlantis. I've always been fascinated by it. And so I decided to write an origin story for how that legend came to be. And so it's really fun to do a lot of research into what people believe about Atlantis, why the island sunk, why the gods got angry, and all of that. And I basically came up with my own character named Sophia, who's a scribe from Atlantis, and she tries to save her island, doesn't go well, and the end of the story is very fun because it is my way of showing how the Atlantis legend made it into the world. So this is kind of an approach I took for an origin story, and origin stories are always very fun to do. This one is called Wickedness and Wonder, a fairy tale anthology by Wilding Publishing. I have a story in here called Out of the Oven, and it is a sequel to Hansel and Gretel. Basically, the story is set years after Hansel and Gretel escaped the Wicked Witch and pushed her into the oven, and they think the witch is dead, but turns out she survived and she comes back for round 2. So Out of the Oven is the second face-off with the Wicked Witch, and that was so much fun to do because the cool thing about doing a sequel is you're able to use the original story as a foundation for yours. And when I wrote Out of the Oven, I had very specific details in mind that directly called back to the original to make it a true sequel. And so this is another approach you can take as well. If you're interested in doing a retelling or reimagining, you can do a sequel to the story that you want to reimagine. Next, I'm going to talk about stories that are inspired by other works. You have a lot of freedom in this area, but you also have to be careful. So we've all had experiences where we were watching a movie or reading another book and thought, oh my gosh, I kind of want to write a story that's inspired by that character or that plot or something like that. And you're completely free to do so as long as you're not including specific details from that work if it's not in the public domain. So for example, I love Percy Jackson by Rick Riordan. Percy Jackson is not in the public domain, and I would never go anywhere near doing a reimagining of Percy Jackson because I don't want to get sued by Disney. However, I did write a young adult fantasy that is a Little Red Riding Hood reimagining meets Greek mythology that was heavily inspired by Percy Jackson. Now, if you read my book and Percy Jackson, there are no direct parallels to Percy Jackson that are seen in my book. However, there are subtle ties, like there's a prophecy, there's a quest, but those are seen in other fantasy stories, right? Like a prophecy isn't exclusive to Percy Jackson, a quest isn't either, but that series inspired my book. And so in that instance, I am not in danger in getting in trouble because I didn't do a reimagining or retelling or pull any specific details from Percy Jackson. It's just that was the book that inspired mine. And authors do this all the time, and it doesn't need to be with a book. It can be with a movie. Maybe there's a song you love and the message of the song inspires the story. That's totally fine. You just cannot quote lyrics from the song or use specific details from the song. Song copyright is a whole other beast that I'm not going to get into, but it's always okay to write stories inspired by other works or simply by other authors. And this brings me to sharing another example from my own published stories. This is an anthology called Stolen by Easton Tales Publishing. I have a story in here called The Crimson Ring, and it is heavily inspired by Edgar Allan Poe's work. Not a specific story, just his work in general. It's very atmospheric, it's very lyrical, it's probably the darkest story I've ever written. It's a gothic horror, so set in a gothic mansion, and it has similarities to many of the themes and elements that are often found in Poe's work. And so even though The Crimson Ring is not a reimagining of Poe's stories, it is heavily inspired by his work. And so that's an example as well. You don't necessarily need to be inspired by a specific piece of art, but you could also be inspired to do something based on a certain author or an artist or something like that that gives you inspiration. And finally, I'm going to talk about original lore. I love coming up with original folklore, mythology, especially for my fantasy and romantasy stories. And this is where you have a ton of freedom because there are often very recognizable elements, tropes, and things that are commonly found in fairy tales and folklore and myths. And so the fun thing about doing original lore is that you can take some of your favorite tropes and elements and bring your own twist to them. And I'm going to share one example from my story that is published in an anthology. This anthology is called Dragonflight by Dragonstone Press, and I have a young adult cozy fantasy in here called A Pinch of Cinnamon and Lore. The whole premise of this story is based on original folklore tied to cinnamon and vanilla. In the valley in the story, vanilla is seen to be good luck, and cinnamon is believed to bring bad luck. In fact, there is a legend in the valley that says if somebody uses cinnamon, whether that's in cooking or burning a cinnamon candle, if they use cinnamon in any way, it brings the jinxed rain that showers the valley in bad luck. And so this whole story is based on this lore and belief of vanilla and cinnamon, and it really gets into cultural beliefs and those kinds of stories that are passed down from generation to generation that you don't really know the basis of where these ideas came from. Like, why is vanilla good luck? Why is cinnamon bad luck? Those are just things that the people in this valley believe, which is commonly seen in legends based or specific to different regions, right? So I like to pull on that aspect of folklore to create my own lore based on vanilla and cinnamon, and that was a lot of fun to write. So I hope that gave you a nice glimpse into the spectrum from retellings to original lore. And to wrap up, I just wanted to share a piece of advice. And this is something that I have become super aware of, especially after I wrote my Poe reimagining in The Shadows in the Raven's Eye anthology. And that is, if you're doing a retelling or a reimagining of somebody else's story, it comes with a responsibility, because if you had someone reimagine one of your stories in the future, I'm sure you would want them to do so with respect and care. As creatives, we are given opportunities to be inspired by and to reimagine and retell works that are in the public domain, which is incredible. But we should do so responsibly and respectfully. When I did my reimagining of Silence, I did so knowing that Poe left such an impact on the literary world, especially in horror. He has such a massive and lasting legacy, and writing a story came with a lot of pressure because I wanted to respect his fable and I wanted to bring my own reimagining to that in a respectful way. And so I gave a lot of thought and care to the way I did that. And so I would just highly suggest for you to do the same, especially if you're reimagining a work of literature with a known author like Poe or like Shakespeare or something like that. And I take a very similar approach when I'm playing classical music. I'm a classical pianist as well, and when I play my favorite pieces by Mozart and Debussy, I'm doing so understanding that these composers created these pieces centuries ago, and I'm getting the opportunity to play them in the 21st century. And every time I sit down to play one of those pieces, I'm fully aware that this is somebody else's work and I need to perform it with care and integrity and respect and responsibility. And so that to me is just another form of retelling or reimagining art, just through the musical lens. So yeah, I would just highly recommend to retell and reimagine these stories with care and bring something fresh and unique and leave your mark on the literary world. So I hope you loved this presentation. I really enjoyed chatting about retellings, reimaginings, and original lore. I hope you feel inspired to do your own retellings and reimaginings and maybe come up with a story that has all original folklore or an original fairy tale or something like that. I really appreciate you listening to my presentation and watching. And thank you so much to Teresa and the whole team at the Writers Workout for having me back for a second year. I had so much fun. If you would like to connect with me online, I'm most active on Twitter and Instagram. My handle is at Demi Schwartz. You can also find my website, demimschwartz.com, to stay updated with all that I'm doing. And thank you so much again for watching. I hope you enjoy the other presentations during this conference and get out there and do your own retellings, reimaginings, and create stories with original lore. Thank you.